So today I would like to talk about Bertha von Suttner, peace activist and as a public mediator. Last year, the beginning of the First World War, then exactly 100 years ago, was widely commemorated. Also in 1914, however, one of the most fanatic protesters against such a war of attrition died. This person was the Austrian pacifist and peace activist Bertha von Suttner. The commemoration of Suttner's death received considerable attention in the German and to a lesser extent also in the international media. The occasion of Suttner's death, or of Suttner's commemoration, even inspired the creation of a television drama focused on the relationship between Suttner and the Swedish inventor Alfred Nobel. This renewed attention for Baroness von Suttner, or Friedensbertha, peace Bertha, as she was somewhat disparagingly called during her lifetime, seems to be a suitable occasion to further examine this intriguing writer and public speaker. Suttner transformed from a typical 19th century character destined for a reclusive family life into a highly esteemed, yet also much ridiculed and criticized celebrity. In the last 20 years of her life, Suttner mingled with the influential artists, thinkers and statesmen of her time, from the earlier mentioned Alfred Nobel and the best-selling writer Karl May to Edward VII and Theodore Roosevelt. As a public speaker, Bertha von Suttner paved the way for a modern generation of writers who entered the public arena with more than written material alone. Although Barbara Eng rightly asserts that around 1900, writing or typing women could be spotted everywhere, a broader development seemed to be materializing during the same period, one that applied to the German literary world at large. Literati could no longer be merely regarded as writers who consciously used their literary skills to recycle age-old themes, motives, and discourses, nor could they be exclusively seen as authors who created in a flash of divine inspiration. Ever more often, writers need to market their own persona with the paradoxical aim of legitimizing their uniqueness as a writer. In essence, this required a presence in the public sphere, which at the turn of the century became increasingly accessible. The strategy of self-marketing as a writer was soon superseded by a tendency toward self-representation as an intellectual. In this transition, the writer's speech tended to form an independent field of activity, thus detaching itself from the core literary process of writing, in a taxonomical sense at least. From that time onward, entire generations of writers could be found behind the lectern. The first generation to do so was born in the 1860s and included writers such as Ricarda Huch, Gerhard Hauptmann, Hermann Bach, and Frank Wedekind. It is not a coincidence that this very generation was also the first one to encounter and enforce the modernist dogma of authorial singularity, so-called Individualisierungszwang. My own records of this period, which contain speeches held by 124 modernist authors, only suggest two exceptions to this general rule. There were two writers who spoke and who were born, who were from an earlier generation, this generation from the 1860s. And those writers were Karl May and Bertha von Suttner. In the case of female writers, but also for women in general, the emancipatory effect of öffentliche Selbstbehauptung, of publicly standing up for one's own ideals and ideas, was profound. Just as Ruth Whittle suggests, the measure and kind of women's participation in, quote, public and particularly in semi-public discourses will shed more light on the role of women writers at the end of the long 19th century. If considering the speech as an act that emancipated male as well as female citizens, one easily discovers that the audible dimension of the speech prevailed over the visual one. Against this backdrop, there are many scholars, German as well as English ones, who have conversely pointed out that femininity was associated with a culture of silence, with one of not speaking until well into the 19th century. Be that as it may, A disposition to verbal expression, one of the most primordial human urges, was shared by men and women alike. Indeed, as early as 1791, French writer and female activist Bertha conceived a pastiche entitled Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. In this pastiche, she called for the, quote, right to mount the rostrum, unquote, as a precondition for female sovereignty. Toward the end of the 19th century, society eventually became more receptive to this idea. This modest change was not brought about through top-down decision-making, but rather through the conduct of individual women. Claire Cahill has noted that, quote, by the 1880s, a new and increasingly vocal woman had emerged in both England and America, confident in her singularity, outspoken in the public arena, calling vociferously for suffrage and a legitimate voice in the affairs of state. End quote. The situation was no different in the German world, be it that such a female singularity only emerged some 2 decades later. However, by comparison, female writers did not seem to be avid speakers, and the uptrend in speech delivery that marked the Weimar era can mainly be ascribed to male writers. For this reason, the speaker, Bertha von Suttner, should be observed with even greater interest. And in this paper, I will analyze some of Suttner's speeches. I will analyze these speeches as acts of mediation. Mediation, or Vermittlung in German, is first of all to be understood on a contextual level, as an attempt to reconcile parties with different interests. Such an interpretation, of course, refers to Suttner's many speeches at peace conferences, where some of the core issues, for example the question of disarmament, ineluctably led to frictions among the participating delegates. Although consistently opting for the most idealistic side on the sliding scale of hawkish and dovish attitudes, Suttner still had to plant her pacifist ideas in the minds of her audience. Rhetorical strategies played an important part here. By rhetoric, I mean the post-1800 fields that remained after classical rhetoric had declined as a coherent system of thought and as a rigid didactic method. This decline did not at all imply that rhetoric had disappeared. Rather, it had transformed or fragmented into specialized instructions for persuasion and self-presentation. Complementing the modernist call for authorial singularity, these instructions were aimed at fulfilling the needs of different social groups. Such needs were all rooted in the principal aim of public self-representation, or öffentliche Selbstbehauptung. Reinhard Meyer-Kalpus has, for instance, also pointed at this pragmatic revaluation of rhetoric in his book on 20th century oratory and declamation. One of the rhetorical strategies happened to involve the second form of mediation that I want to tackle, and this is the mediation between different discords. These discursive bridges, as I would like to call them, were recurring elements in the Suttner's written as well as spoken word, which is why I will clarify them during the analysis of her speeches. And before I turn to her speech practice, it might be useful to provide some general details about her life and about her remarkable career as a peace activist. And with this biographical overview, I also wish to illustrate Suttner's transformation from a silent writer into a speaking mediator. For this, there are 3 steps in her career that I will use to illustrate this transformation. It is crucial to perceive this case study from Suttner in the light of the speech mania that engulfed the German world, notably the literary one, from 1900 onwards, because this trend was by no means self-evident. Bertha von Suttner was born in 1843 into the aristocratic Kinski family, who were known for their long tradition of military service. Just as many of his family members, Suttner's father, Franz Josef Count Kinski, was a general in the Austro-Hungarian army. He died shortly before Bertha was born. Because her mother was not of noble birth, Bertha was not fully recognized as a member of the Kinski family, who lived by the self-protective mores of of the highly secluded Austrian nobility. The troubled relationship with her family had a lasting impact on Bertha. On the one hand, she did not want to be reminded of her status as an outcast who lived in the in-between of aristocracy and bourgeoisie. Yet on the other hand, she was proud of her aristocratic maiden name. Her social roots even inspired her thoughts on peace, which she tended to condense into the idea of the Middelmensch or the Vollmensch, the noble human or the total human. And Karl May, the other person who also spoke during this period, who was from the same generation as Suttner, he admired her for her peace ideas. May was also a pacifist. And he used this concept of the Edelmensch also in his speeches. In 1876, Suttner went to Paris in order to work as a secretary in the residence of an industrial magnate, a certain Alfred Nobel, only to decide to move to the Caucasus with her newlywed husband, Arthur von Suttner. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, which was partially fought out in the Caucasus, initiated a change in Bertha's worldview, even though she did not experience the horrors of the war at first hand. She started writing serials, feuilletons, for German and Austrian newspapers and magazines, after which she turned to novel and essay writing. This was her first step towards becoming a public mediator. In 1887, Suttner for the first time heard about the activities of the International Arbitration and Peace Association, the IAPA, which had been established a few years before in London. She was enthused by the fact alone that there existed such a thing as an organization dedicated to peace. This epiphanic moment was reflected in her book, The Machine Age, das Maschinenzeitalter, that appeared later that year. The Machine Age consisted of fictional speeches from the future that commented on Suttner's own violent times. At the same time, Suttner used the novel to unfold her own fundamental vision of everlasting peace. However, just as her previous books, this book appeared with a pseudonym on the front cover. While Suttner's other works have been written under the pen name Beun or Beun, she now chose for the neutral designation someone, jemand. You cannot see it on the PowerPoint because this is a later edition. In 1889, she published Lay Down Your Arms, Die Waffen nieder, the novel that would make her world famous. This is a novel that realistically, although one could even say naturalistically, depicts the destructive forces of warfare. The Machine Age, and especially Lay Down Your Arms, constituted a personal breakthrough for Suttner for more than one reason. Of course, they established her fame as a writer, but perhaps more important, they were also the first works which she openly claimed to place in the general public sphere, instead of seeking recognition among literary circles alone. While her earlier work had largely sprung from reflections on her social environment and inner struggles, she now brought up a controversial issue that concerned every citizen. Moreover, compared to Suttner's earlier work, these two books were born out of personal conviction rather than out of financial necessity. She and her husband, Arthur von Suttner, had constant financial concerns, so they also did journalistic work for the newspapers. Here we become aware of the second step in Suttner's career, namely her transition from being a writer, who literally remained anonymous, to becoming a famous public figure. It might therefore not come as a surprise that Lay Down Your Arms was the first book, or the first work that she published under her own name. Also, we can observe how she relinquished the role of a writer who was merely writing. Instead, she entered into a dialogue with the readers in the projected speaker-audience constellation of the fictional speeches from the Machine Age. Following the overwhelming success of Lay Down Your Arms, Bertha von Suttner fully committed herself to the peace movement. Her pacifist efforts would be generously funded by Alfred Nobel, with whom she had become close friends during her time in Paris. In 1891, Suttner founded the Austrian Peace Association, and she was also invited to the Third Universal Peace Congress in Rome. This was a personal breakthrough also for her. In Rome, she delivered her first public speech ever, an event that symbolized the third and final step in her career. Suttner had become a public mediator who attended and organized conferences, conferred with numerous heads of state, and who spoke on any possible occasion. Here we can see a picture of her. She's speaking in Berlin in 1912. She has a mourning clothes on. Her husband had died a few years before, but she probably also wore these to acquire, to create a visionary image to really make an impact on the audience. Within the scope of this paper, it would consume too much time to elaborate on all her further public appearances, because she literally held hundreds of speeches. I will, however, sum up some of her biggest accomplishments. She attended both Hague conferences, the one in 1899 and in 1907, during which she practically worked as a non-state actor, long before such a designation was actually used. The term was, I think, coined in the 1950s. So, at the first Hague conference, she conducted a salon where she mediated between various state delegates. It was an informal setting where everybody just could walk in and could talk with each other, but also with Suttner. She was an important mediator in this salon. She went on multiple speech tours in, for example, Germany and Scandinavia. And she also toured the US twice, in 1904 and in 1912, where she spoke in all parts of the country. And you can see her in San Francisco. This is her second US tour in a women's movement. She is sitting on the left, and the woman on the right apparently was the wife of William Randolph Hearst, the media tycoon. Her US tours lasted for months, and regardless where she arrived, Suttner was welcomed as a celebrity. She, for example, also spoke in the famous Torical Strategies. I don't know if this picture from the actual performance when she was there gives an impression of how much people attended these speeches. So she regularly spoke in front of hundreds and thousands of people. On her first US tour, she also met Theodore Roosevelt at the White House, a statesman whom she considered to be, at that time at least, an important friend of the peace movement. Her fame was also reflected by the fact that she was recorded by the new media of her day, by the phonograph as well. She was also filmed. However, her biggest triumph came when she was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905. Suttner's idealism had most likely inspired Alfred Nobel to establish a category for peace in the first place. By using this three-step model, we can trace the mediating role adopted by Suttner during the latter half of her life, as this role unfolded in her writings, in her speeches, and during her encounters with contemporary state leaders and other social-political actors. Suttner's mediating role formed a component of her role as an intellectual. Intellectuals are distinct from, say, politicians, in that their actions cannot be reduced to one particular social field. Instead, they switch and mediate between various social fields. As a non-state actor avant la lettre, Suttner was not restricted by institutional ties. In principle, she was thus able to interact freely with any type of prominent figures, be they politicians such as Roosevelt, writers such as Paul Heyse, Émile Zola, and Lev Tolstoy, or fellow activists such as Alfred Fried and Hodgson Pratt. Pratt was the one who established the International Peace Association in London. That's from the epiphany for Suttner when she heard about the existence of this association. In addition, I argue that Suttner's intellectual position allowed her to select and combine a wide range of discourses. The speech was a pivotal genre in recycling these discourses and creating new value through their combination. Such discursive combinations, or bridges, as I called them earlier, constituted the main rhetorical operator in Suttner's pacifist accounts. The discursive bridges particularly complemented the speech's structural features, among which the most striking ones are repetition and exemplarity. In this manner, discursive rhetorical operators helped Suttner, and indeed any other speaking intellectual, in transmitting her or his ideas to a larger audience. This rhetorical operation is exemplified by Suttner's noble lecture, which is entitled Revaluation of the Peace Movement. Given at the Norwegian Storting in 1906, this lecture contained both a historical and a visionary account. In accordance with the Nobel Committee's requirement to deal with the topic or accomplishment for which the prize has been awarded, Suttner talked about the work that she had done for the peace movement in the past. She would, however, not have been Suttner if she had not addressed all the things that still needed to be done. This behavior immediately becomes apparent in the opening lines of her lecture. I will first show the German original, and I will read the English translation. The stars of eternal truth and right have always shone in the firmament of human understanding. The process of bringing them down to earth, remolding them into practical forms, imbuing them with vitality, and then making use of them has been a long one. One of the eternal truths is that happiness is created and developed in peace. One of the eternal rights is the individual's right to live. The strongest of all instincts, that of self-preservation, is an assertion of this right, affirmed and sanctified by the ancient commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." In her introduction, Suttner comes straight to the point, an approach that was and is atypical when compared to that of many other speeches in general and other noble lectures in particular. Suttner's introduction lacks a conventional rhetorical style. Instead of showing her gratitude and praising the Nobel Committee, she expresses her pacifist conviction, one of eternal truth, as she calls it herself. Yet, because of its distinctive phrasing, the introduction to the Nobel lecture is rhetorical in its own right. It does not include patterns that can be denominated with the help of standard rhetorical terminology. There is neither a captatio benevolentiae, nor is there a modesty topos. Suttner does, however, introduce a discursive bridge that she systematically develops into a rhetorical scheme over the course of her lecture. The discursive bridge in the evolution of the peace movement brings together the two contrasting, if not competing, social fields of science and Christian religion. The relation between both fields was particularly vexed in the second half of the long 19th century, with new discoveries and scientific insights gradually undermining Christianity's claim to eternal truth. Suttner reconnects them by using commonplaces from both fields. Phrases such as eternal truth and rights, sanctified, but also entity, which she only uses in the German original, and her reference to one of the Ten Commandments originate in, or are at least associated with, Christianity. Suttner, however, did not use the term Christian as such, and she had a good reason for this. By using the religious discourse, she essentially wanted to retain the intrinsically human desire for salvation and harmony, separated from its transcendental interpretation of Christianity, and consequently realign it with her own ultimate goal of world peace. She then strengthened this new connection with a scientific discourse. Suttner was well read in the works of contemporary scientists and thinkers, among which Charles Darwin, Ernst Haeckel, Henry Thomas Butler, and Herbert Spencer. Suttner, just as many of her contemporaries, believed in the ability of natural sciences to socially and morally improve humanity. She therefore based her arguments about peace on the idealistic constituents of Darwin's theory of evolution, Spencer's ideas on social Darwinism, and Butler's book on the history of civilization. Their impact can be noted in this excerpt from Suttner's introduction, in which she cites the instinct of self-preservation The scientific origins of this discourse are explicated a few paragraphs later, when Suttner dismisses the objections raised by those who might think that wars are timeless events. The times are, indeed, as violent as ever, she admits, but she is quick to add the following argument. That the world is ever-changing and developing is still not generally recognized, since the knowledge of the laws of evolution, which control all life, whether in the geological time span or in society, belongs to a recent period of scientific development. That the future will always be 1 degree better than what is past and discarded is the conviction of those who understand the laws of evolution and try to assist their action. Only through the understanding and deliberate application of natural laws and forces in the material domain as well as in the moral will the technical devices and the social institutions be created which will make our lives easier, richer and more noble. Suttner optimistically extends the scientific sphere of influence to include the social besides the geological and the moral besides the physical. She also frequently plays with the tension between her mental ideals and the could-be fulfillment of these ideals in the future. In consequence, her message should not be interpreted as a naive belief in moral progress. It is merely the result of her rhetorical strategy, that is, of the continuous interplay between two contrasting discourses. The main interplay that we saw here is the one between religion and science. This discursive bridge has been a recurring motive in Suttner's work ever since her revelatory books, The Machine Age and Lay Down Your Arms were published. The scientific bridge featured most prominently as a persuasive marker in Suttner's speeches. Her noble lecture contained many other discursive opposites that appeared in close proximity to the scientific religious bridge. Some examples are understanding as opposed to connected with application, also ideals versus achievements, the realm of ideas versus physical living in effective forms, and also the peace idea versus the organizations, and the fog of pious theories versus the light of attainable and realistically ambitious goals. The same goes for Suttner's other speeches. In 1912, for instance, she introduced her own lecture series in Vienna. She acknowledged the fact that wars were still imminent all around the globe, but she merely saw the situation as a temporary setback. With even greater conviction, she announced an age of world peace and compared the salvation to come to a, quote, slow yet majestic sunrise, which is obscured by low-lying clouds, which can never be stopped. Unquote. In a speech-like letter from 1914, Suttner addressed the women's branch of the German Peace Association. She called for a revolt of both the heart and the mind, thereby reverting to the earlier mentioned opposition of ideals versus achievements and ideas versus forms. In Suttner's noble lecture, the religious scientific bridge was also encapsulated in her maxim, thinking idealistically, acting pragmatically, ideal in denken, praktisch in tun. This simultaneously characterized herself as a mediator of the peace movement. It may not come as a surprise that scholars have often characterized the scientific imagery used by Suttner and her contemporaries as pseudo-religious. By stressing the natural aspects of religion and conversely by highlighting the spiritual dimension of scientific thinking, Suttner interwove both discourses without completely erasing their respective socio-discursive origins. In some cases, she even managed to concentrate both discourses in a single phrase or a single word. When she talked about the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," in her noble lecture, she used the phrase, "ein uraltes Gesetz." Ein uraltes Gebot. And this phrase can be best translated as an age-old commandment. While commandment has a religious connotation, age-old, combined with the indefinite article "an," made the origins of the commandment ambiguous. Another discursive bridge, frequently constructed by Suttner, can be described as unity and alterity. It was a common strategy for turn-of-the-century peace activists, feminists, and liberal advocates of the Jewish cause to identify with groups who also experienced major social resistance and who were subsequently labeled as different. Suttner herself used to criticize the increasingly anti-Semitic and anti-feminist tones in the German public debate. She even helped her husband with the erection of an Austrian defense league against anti-Semitism, and she encouraged female activism within the peace movement. However, she always made sure to emphasize that these causes were part of, and thus secondary to, the struggle for peace. We can therefore conclude that Suttner used this and other discursive bridges in order to activate whoever was listening to her speech. Even Suttner's act of activating involved a form of mediation. While she anticipated the inevitable arrival of a new and brighter age, she nevertheless gave her audience the choice of deciding for or against the pacifist picture that she had drawn. Thus, she presented the time as a pivotal one, in which the choices of her audience might determine the outcome of the clash between the old age of warfare and the new age of peace. This was the only opposition where she did not apply her rhetoric of discursive bridging, where she did not accept a reconciliation between the two discursive constituents. Suttner indeed declared war against war, or Krieg den Krieg, as she said herself. In the end, she did everything for peace. Her role as an intellectual gave her the power to mediate between those who had the executive authority to enforce peace. It also allowed her to address larger numbers of people, be it in written or in spoken words, in order to change public opinion. Suttner was one of the first to realize the potential of publicity and propaganda. Both are words that she herself frequently used. She asked Alfred Nobel, for example, for funding. She spoke about we need publicity for the movement. These two tangible forms of mediation were supported by a discursive one. The scientific religious bridge prevailed over the traditional rhetorical methods, which Suttner still also employs. Moreover, her mediation between scientific and religious discourses resulted in a rhetorical scheme that reflected the macro-historical situation around 1900. Some of the major debates at that time dealt with conflicts between scientific objectivity and spiritual salvation, but also with struggles between different social groups and classes. Of course, public debate also focused on the revaluation of art's claim to truthfulness, the so-called Wahrheitsdiscours, effectively turning this claim into a, quote, naive authorial truth, unquote. Suttner discursively integrated all these debates into her speeches. She subordinated them to a universal quest for peace, and in that she was definitely rhetorical. Thank you.